In the past, people, I think, have viewed any talk of corporate power and control as sort of a conspiracy theory and paranoia by lefties, whereas now I think it's only the extreme right who openly and directly feel their interests are aligned with the corporates who would deny that the corporates are almost running the show directly. I suppose the first question would be, do you feel that Chomsky was on the right track as far back as the 70s when he was talking about direct corporate dominance over the American administration and the media?
Chomsky was right in the 70s, but I think it's been true in the American political system much longer than that. As far back as the late 19th century, when the Americans began to develop their empire, and when the American monopoly corporations started to exert their power, which included the major oil corporations a little bit later, they have dominated political life. They have controlled the political establishment, they have chosen the presidents, and they have determined the foreign and domestic policy to a large extent. What happened was that this tended to be hidden to a degree, I think, after World War II, or during and after World War II. But there was still this element whereby an argument was being made that the Americans were interested in promoting democracy against communism and so on and so forth. What Chomsky was doing in the 70s was actually exposing it, pointing out that the war in Vietnam was not a war against communism as such. It was a war of control and conquest. Or even a little bit earlier, that the Korean War also was that fitted into that character, and in both of those countries, millions of people died as a consequence of these wars that were imposed on their country. Millions of people, and then the American empire in Central America was supporting some of the most brutal military dictatorships right through that region. Death squads were operating. Military regimes were established that maintained their power through mass slaughter, and it was never heard about, but literally a small place like Guatemala, anything up to 500,000 people were slaughtered in a period of a few decades as these military regime in that country sought to maintain its position with the support of the United States, and it was repeated not in such a massively bloodthirsty scale, but it was repeated in Argentina and in Chile and Nicaragua and in El Salvador and other countries, Central America. So Chomsky was trying to explain that reality and pointing to who was behind it, whose interests were being served by these policies.
I think what happened to Chomsky is a familiar tale in the last and probably this century, and that is that he knew he was onto something. He could see it very clearly. He got tremendous response and support wherever he could get his message out, be it in public speaking forums, in his publications, etc. But within America, he rapidly found that he couldn't get past a sort of electronic curtain of the media was so utterly controlled by the very people that he was criticising and pointing out their role. They in turn were shutting him out naturally as a matter of self-preservation from getting to the mass audience. And this forced him to examine the media in the same way that he looked at Vietnam and Central America. And he found some, well, what seemed to be interesting, but again, are you going to tell me that they were already well-known facts about the control of the media? And is the media still under the thumb of the large corporate interests in the US or Britain or wherever the country is involved.
And it only requires sort of 3 or 4 of these media monopolies to adopt a similar position, and then the news wires which are dependent on them, or the news feeds around the world which are dependent on them, and you have almost a single voice being presented to the world, rather than this age producing a diversity of voices. It's producing almost a single voice in the major media. The diversity is occurring in a sort of underground way, or through alternative channels which the internet has opened up. But in terms of the media that reaches 90% of people 90% of the time, then it's almost a single voice that's being presented. And Chomsky saw this process, recognised it, saw himself being cut out of it, saw the deliberate lies and omissions, if not deliberate lies, then at least the omissions of fact, and sought to expose that. And he did so in tremendous detail. But Noam Chomsky was virtually ignored. Noam Chomsky is one of the leading intellectuals in the world today. His own specialty, he's a Harvard professor. His own speciality is linguistics, and he made some pioneering work in that field and internationally recognised. But he has an encyclopedic mind, and he's able to study and write about a whole range of subjects. He is cut out of the American media to an extent that I think would astonish people, because most people have heard of him, if nothing else. They know, even if they haven't read an article by him or a book by him, they know what a prominent and important person he is in the world, intellectually and politically. Many people have read books or obtained articles. But if you did an internet search on US major national daily newspapers, all of them, with the name Noam Chomsky, you might, in the course of a year, pick up 1 or 2 references, and that would be it. And more than likely it would be some dismissive comment by some right-wing columnist, rather than him being able to present his views to the American public. He's completely shut out. He is almost never put on TV, and yet he can come to New Zealand and fill the town hall for a meeting. At the drop of a hat. And he can do that in the United States also. If he goes to a university, there will be thousands of people there to listen to him, but it will not be reported in the media. It's an extraordinary story.
I think that the thing about the Chomsky in the media isn't Chomsky in the media, it's the media. It just so happens that Chomsky is very effective. He's, as you said, very erudite. He's got a good reputation. He's extremely intelligent. He's utterly well read, perhaps 4 times more well read than any other academic that they can wheel out, and he could down anyone in a decent one-on-one argument, etc. So he's sort of the cruise missile of liberalism, and I think long ago the academics and the forces for conservatism recognised that he was undefeatable in a straight-up debate, and concluded that there was only one thing to do, and that was to shut the guy down. Now, you could say, well, poor Chomsky and dear, but the implication is that the better you get, the more penetrating your observations. This is not a good thing. This is not going to automatically make you more effective at, enabling democracy to become real and to empowering yourself and others. On the contrary, in the current climate, it just makes you a threat, and all the more likely to become, subject to various forms of repression. In the case of Chomsky, it's not physical, but in every other sense, his ideas are utterly repressed, directly and completely repressed. And the way that that's done is very educational when Chomsky writes about it, because he's examined that too. But it does appear to indicate that not only militarily do you feel helpless in the face, or does anyone, entire countries and zones feel helpless in the face of the United States, But intellectually, it appears that they also are undefeatable. Am I being pessimistic, realistic, or can you give me some hope?
I've got to be an optimist. I've got a hope for the future of humanity and the future of the world, and there are some signs of optimism. It's true that they've monopolised the media. It's true that there is a single voice, but it's also true that they can't shut it down completely in terms of there being alternatives. Chomsky is a bestseller. His books are published, and he is a bestseller, including in the United States. His books on September 11 were bestsellers. He may not appear in the New York Times, but he goes to the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. Similarly, but it's a trouble to get his books published, and they're often have to be put out by small publishers first before they're picked up by a big publisher. Similarly, Michael Moore. He wrote a book called Stupid White Men. Michael Moore, who won the Oscar for the documentary on American violence, which is a strong critique of American foreign policy. But the publishers of his book, the printers of his book, the publishers of his book, demanded that it be pulped after they'd printed 50,000 copies of an initial run. They printed them just before September 11. It's highly critical of the Bush administration, so they demanded that Michael Moore destroy them, pulp them, and pay for the cost of pulping them, and rewrite the book to be less critical of George Bush. Michael Moore refused, and then when a librarian in some rural town in America heard the story, because Michael Moore was doing a speaking tour, heard the story, she got onto the net, she got onto the Librarians Association. The publisher was flooded with thousands of emails from enraged librarians at the suppression of free speech, and Michael Moore makes a joke, beware the enraged librarian, and the publisher was forced to back down, published a book, it became a bestseller, went straight to the top of the New York Times bestsellers list, and then subsequently his documentary went to got the Oscar, so then it got released in more theatres than ever before, and he's got a new contract for a TV program when the initial thing had been to try and shut him down. Similarly, there's one other example, Gore Vidal, who's one of the leading historical novelists in the United States. He wrote some searing essays on September 11 and post-September 11, which was published in Italy, but no one would touch it in the United States. No one would publish a collection of these essays that were published abroad. Eventually, it broke through. Again, finally it was picked up by a publisher. Again, it went to number one in the bestsellers list. So there is a hunger for information. Michael Moore has these meetings up and down the country where he's talking about some of these issues, and they're attended by thousands of people in small towns and cities. There is a hunger among the American people to know the truth. And I think the internet is revolutionizing, because I think we are moving now, at least for part of the world that has access, but that's part of the world that's the richest part of the world, which is also the part of the world where the wars are coming from that are being inflicted on the globe. But in that part of the world, the internet has become a mass medium. And this was decisive in recent elections in Korea. The internet actually replaced the daily newspapers and television as the main source of news for people, and the independently published magazines on the internet, which had a completely different view from the very conservative establishment press, got behind the more liberal candidate, and millions of people were accessing the internet daily and downloading these pages on a daily basis. And now this particular internet site, I can't remember its name, but it's become one of the main or the main sort of site for news for people in Korea. Korea is a little bit different in that virtually every home has very high speed internet access.
The conspiracy theorist in me says, well, look, there's Korea, object lesson.
They will learn from this.
Object lesson in the power of the internet,
yeah,
and the power for it to threaten the standard structures. the government, the very government that funded and that internet development was the one that toppled. Now, you can't tell me that other governments and private organisations throughout the world won't have also seen what happened there. They'll be acutely aware of it. Don't you suspect that the internet too is going to become a major object of distortion, attack, and all sorts of, in the name of security, we're going to have to be scanning all these emails, and various ISPs, of which I'm thinking of myself, will stand out as particular objects of danger. Shouldn't we be sort of forewarned as forearmed in this respect?
No, the internet is a way of disseminating information, and in that regard, I don't believe that they will be able to seize control of it again. I mean, the genie's out of the bottle in terms of that technology. They've been desperately trying to figure out a way that they can control it, that they can control access to it, that in terms of both of the monopolies, the Microsofts and so on, and in terms of how they can censor it or limit the role of it. Hasn't been awfully successful, those attempts, and sure, the monitoring by the authorities will continue. Sure, there will be more intrusion, more spy powers and police powers to access material, but they can only go so far. People are still strongly wedded to democratic rights in the main, and most of these countries that we're talking about here, in terms of, say this Anglo-Saxon bloc that we've been talking about, Britain, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, they certainly are deeply attached to the democratic freedoms that they have, and I think that there remain limits, and that when they go over these limits, then they run into trouble. The Americans have a police spying sort of law called Patriot law, and dozens, it might be hundreds of cities now, are basically saying they will not comply with this law. The city councils are saying they will not comply with this law because it requires handing over all sorts of information from libraries and this, that, and the other thing. And the city council is saying no, this is a step too far. We will not comply. We will not cooperate. Librarians are saying no, we will not cooperate. The power of the librarian is exerting itself again. But it's just the power of the citizen. It's the power of the citizen saying we are not going to be party to this process. And so this is where we get this information, but we need an alternative organisation. We have global monopoly capital with its multinational corporations and its control of the media and so on, and we need a people's power across the world. And that's also what's happening, because I talked about the internet connecting people in regard to those anti-war demonstrations, but it wasn't just that, you see, because the call for the protest came from a gathering of tens of thousands of people in Europe, the social forum process. In November, in Europe there was 40 or 50,000, plus 500,000 people on a demonstration against the war. Then 100,000 people attending the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre in January. And this movement is connecting the people's organisations of the world, trade union organisations, farmers and peasant organisations, women's groups, anti-globalisation groups, indigenous people's organisations, NGOs that are concerned about world debt and anti-poverty groups, and they're coming together as a loose coalition of the dispossessed, of the people who are said to be powerless. But the people who are said to be powerless got together in these massive gatherings and agreed on organising international activity on a particular day across the globe and pulled 10 to 30 million people into it. And this movement is just beginning. And so we do need not just information, alternative information, but we need the organisation that can also connect people together and organise them into political and social movements, because there's only really one way you can change the world, and you have to change the power structure. You have to change that relationship between the corporate elite who are controlling things and dominating, and the mass of the people. And those people need to take control of the society, of its economy, of the way foreign policy is made, and turn it into a democratic thing, and reach out across the globe to their brothers and sisters in other countries who they should have no sort of conflict of interest with. We're citizens of the same world. We live on the same planet, which is dying around us and which we need to save. And we are being exploited often by the same multinational corporations, which are destroying our rivers and our fields and our cities and choking us with their poisons. We need to reach out to that humanity. The World Social Forum is part of that organisation. There needs to be others. Trade union movements need to become international to confront these corporations. Political and social movements need to reach out across the globe, and we need to start thinking of ourselves, I think, not as sort of just Kiwis or Australians, or we need to think of ourselves as citizens of the world if we're going to solve the problems of the world, because I'm not sure that we can solve the problems in our own little patch. We have to if we want to solve the problems of the world, then we have to reach out to others and help.
There's one major patch of the world that appears to have immunised itself against democracy, whilst proclaiming it is the centre and source of all democracy, and of course that's the USA, because we don't see these huge social movements. Yes, we might see a Chomsky and a Michael Moore, but they are two people, and yes, they can get big meetings, but only in small towns or in universities.
Yeah, American people historically have shown a tremendous attachment to democracy and a willingness to defend it, and a creativity in looking for alternative social and political ideas. That's gone hand in hand with one of the most venal and corrupt and narrow and ignorant political establishment. That's true. I mean, people who can elect, well, and they don't even do that, you see. I mean, they don't even elect these people, but they can have Reagan and Bush for president. That political establishment is very corrupt. It is completely narrow in its outlook, but it's not even elected. 40 to 50% of the population votes, and when they do vote, the results are manipulated one way or another, including in such a vital thing as a presidential election.
I rest my case about the problem with democracy in America.
That is on that level, but there is another level too, which is the side of American political life that I'm actually more interested in. That there was in the 1930s a massive sort of mobilization that developed the trade union movement in the United States, and into the 40s and even into the 50s. And and then in the 1950s you had the Black Civil Rights Movement, and that was a huge social movement that produced a minor social revolution in the southern parts. But given the media, given the political establishment, given the fact that they are almost completely separated, then they can mould official public opinion to produce sort of paper majorities for support for the American government's position.
That's all very well, Mike, but I think the US entertainment media has portrayed a model which is terribly accurate, and that is a model of gangsterism. It's basically the Wild West was one with gangsterism, and then the Depression era, of course, and the whole of the 20th century, and it's the so-called drug war and all of that. People in America, now throughout the entire world via the Hollywood movie, have come, perhaps unconsciously, to accept gangsterism as you know, it's not good, but it's sort of there, and gangsters can become heroes too, you know, the ones who live. And yes, you might get shot up, but that's just, you know, that's a risk of the job. If you want to make it to the top, then guns and violence, if that gets you there, well, okay, as long as you get there. And I have a terrible feeling that this has become accepted throughout the whole sort of westernised and now, you know, globalised world, deep down as sort of virtual legitimacy, that democracy has lost some of its sheen. Everyone mouths democracy along with apple pie. The two have almost the same credibility. But underneath it, there's sort of, you know, if you talk to young people, it's accepted, you know, well, they happen to be all powerful. It's a gangster country. The whole country's a giant gang. And, you know, what do? You join in or fight it, and if you fight it, you could lose. So, there's no question of democracy. It's just sort of a new realism, a neo-realism, and that is, look, go with either fight the big guys and very likely lose, or join them, and become one of their subjects. And really, Blair, to me, has transparently demonstrated if you can't fight him, join him. That's Blair. He's joined the gang. And there's no possibility of justifying it in terms of law or anything except pure, look, there's the gang and I'm in, because otherwise I'm out.
They're bigger.
Yeah.
They're bigger, they're uglier. Crime syndicates and political machines and big business were connected. The Kennedy family. You had all three in one. Connections to the crime, to the mafia networks, involved in criminal bootlegging activities as foundation of their fortune, establishing political dynasties to continue the name, and Americans are cynical about it, and it's part of, in a sense, it's part of their popular culture. But it's also it's a realism. It also makes American political life often violent, not just social, and not just on the individual level in terms of the street violence and that occurs there, and the violence associated with the culture. But when there are movements that challenge the establishment, then there is often a violent response. And literally thousands of workers died in unionizing the United States. One worker died in New Zealand, unionizing New Zealand, but in the United States, they opened up on strikes with armoured vehicles and machine guns at some of the early miners' strikes, or when they were organising the auto plants in Detroit. This is in the 1920s and 30s. They again had armoured vehicles, state police and state troopers in armoured vehicles using machine guns on them. And in the end, the only way the workers could do it was by occupying the car plants and barricading them with steel and reinforcing and building their own armoured vehicles in a sense or their battlements to protect themselves and win the strikes against Ford and General Motors. These were violent social struggles. Even the black civil rights movement and during the Vietnam War movement, again, dozens of people were shot by the state as part of that. They weren't able to hold it back. So the US is running into problems, even in its own backyard. They used to be able to control that. They used to be able to prevent Lulas and Chavezes and they used to be able to annul those elections and sort of cancel those results. But it's not so easy. There are limits to their power, I believe. They have the technology, but if they were really up against a populist government and a popular war, I think they would be in deep trouble.
The powers that be discovered a tremendous threat in the mass movements, perhaps in the 30s, and ever since they've co-opted them into lobbying groups or renegade individual intellectuals and managed to shut them out on that basis. The United States is the very place where democracy needs to be carried out.
I think a more fundamental critique of the global world order is emerging. That's what the World Social Forum movement is about. That's what is being discussed and debated. We had the triumph of neoliberal capitalism with 1990, the collapse of this bureaucratic state-controlled economies in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And the first Gulf War, and you had a sort of a triumphalism around 1990 in terms of the American dream for what George Bush the first said was a new world order, that they were that the free market and neoliberal ideas with deregulation and privatization and freeing up labour markets and breaking the old power of trade unions and social welfare. All of this was going to liberate this powerful free enterprise impulse which would raise the world. At least that was the argument. I don't think even they believed that, but they certainly achieved a massive transfer of wealth into their hands.
That's what I mean.
But that triumphalism, has not produced, was in their minds, I think. It was in their minds, and they did produce a certain transfer of wealth, but they made the condition worse for the great mass of humanity, and humanity is waking up.